Open source. Open source. Open source. Open source. Tourist. Terrorist. Tourist. Terrorist. Mirror. 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 Mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tist, taste, tist, taste. Mimir, mimir.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Touriste, terroriste, touriste, terroriste. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source. Open source. Open source. Open source. Tourist. Terrorist. Tourist. Terrorist. Mirror. 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 Mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorists. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. ツーリストへ、テラリスト、ツーリストへ、テラリスト。ミラー、ミー、ミラー、ミー。
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist terrorist tourist terrorist. Mirror 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 mirror. Open source. Open source. Open source. Open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror. Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror ma, mirror ma.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, mirror, mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, mirror, mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Touriste, terroriste, touriste, terroriste. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
오픈 소스, 오픈 소스, 오픈 소스, 오픈 소스. 투리스트, 테러리스트, 투리스트, 테러리스트. 미러, 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 미러.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.
Open source, open source, open source, open source. Tourist, terrorist, tourist, terrorist. Mirror, 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 mirror.